I'm going to talk about civil society and data linkage in the age of big data. So I hope this will pick up on points made by Mandy earlier and also Peter, and offer some thoughts about the challenges that big data presents, and indeed changing notions of what data linkage means when we're dealing with new sources of data. First of all, I want to talk about briefly about social informatics and what that is for my research. I then want to briefly look at research data ethics principles as they commonly understood today, and the origins of those principles and what they're trying to do. I then want to consider the implications of big data and data science for the conduct of social research, and implications for ethical principles of the handling of data. When looking at new kinds of data, new kinds of ways of analysing that data, and the consequent risks there may be to privacy and confidentiality of data subjects. And I want to conclude by asking the question, which I don't think I'm equipped to deal with to answer myself, but maybe the audience here can offer some useful thoughts on: is research data ethics as we currently understand it sustainable in an age of big data, with so many different kinds of data being gathered and analysed in ways that were never imagined before? So briefly, social informatics. Well, I think the term was coined by Rob Kling about getting on for nearly 30 years ago, and he defined it as the interdisciplinary study of the design, uses and consequences of information technologies that takes into account their interaction with institutional and cultural contexts. So there's a strong socio-technical emphasis in social informatics, and particularly it borrows on science and technology studies and the tradition of social shaping that has emerged in recent years. The idea that technologies change as they are absorbed into society, and the way that they are absorbed has significant implications for the value that is derived from the technologies. But importantly, it tells us that we should not be distracted by technological determinism and assume that just because technologies exist, they have to be used in certain kinds of ways. And I think what's interesting for me now is how many of the new digital innovations that we are encountering, and many people here are probably using, for example, social media on a regular basis, the ways in which we engage with those, the innovation processes are changing because the value that's in those technologies depends upon what individuals do. There's a kind of network externality factor here, which means that what we get back from these technologies depends on our understanding, evolving understanding of what the value is. The uses of these technologies are not fixed a priori and are discovered, and perhaps even technologies even reinvented as we engage with them. And lots of interesting examples of how that's happened in recent times, beginning with text messaging, for example, but now also I think playing out in interesting ways in the use of Twitter, which has changed quite significantly over the last 5 or 6 years or so, as people have begun to explore and in some senses reinvent what it can do. So innovation is increasingly, I think, best understood as a very much more open and participatory process than has been perhaps the case in previous waves of technological change. And because of that, I think it does call upon us to think about ethics and all the technologies that are being developed to analyse data that's now available in new ways, and try and engage publics in talking about and coming up with solutions to the challenges that these new kinds of data and new kinds of analysis might present us with. So briefly, current research that I'm doing at the moment involves, for example, looking at ways in which people use social media. This in some extent builds upon the work that Christina mentioned before. So looking at the problems of what's called digital wildfires, the way in which sometimes certain content propagates very, very far and wide, and perhaps has impacts that the sources of those content didn't really anticipate, with sometimes undesirable consequences. An important issue, if we use social media as sources of information in our everyday lives and decision making, is knowing if you can trust what you find online. Because, perhaps not surprisingly, not everything you see online is true. Now, does that matter? Well, I think it does, because social media is increasingly used as a source of information by not only individuals in making perhaps more day-to-day and perhaps not very consequential decisions, but also by government agencies, by journalists, and so on and so forth. So there's a great need here to understand if we can determine veracity in ways that will scale up with the amounts of data that are now becoming available. Social media and prediction, crime sensing, data integration and statistical modelling, that's funded by NCRM. And that's looking at ways of linking social media data, reports on crime, with sources such as British Crime Survey and police reports and so forth. And looking at that to see if we can then begin to model crime, predict crime in the future. Peter mentioned urban science and the ways in which you might attempt to use all these new sorts of data for predictive purposes. This is quite a focused example of that. And finally, hate speech and social media, which is about understanding the problems of governance in social media. People seem to behave differently when they use social media than if they are communicating in an environment like this, face to face. People behave in ways that may be seen by other people to be inappropriate and can cause distress and even harm to other people. So we need to understand, I think, to what extent we can begin to mitigate those problems and teach people about behaviour so as they don't inadvertently or even deliberately, in some cases, cause harm to other people by the content that they put out there in the public domain. Now, all of these involve new sources of data, sometimes linked with more traditional sources of data. But if they're not, then they involve different kinds of ways of analysing that data, which exploits relationship attributes that's in that data, which I'm going to argue is a new kind of data linking, because it helps to reveal information about people that they're not even aware that they're disclosing. So, a reminder about research data ethics and what sort of motivates it. We have this idea of harm and data subjects. Depending upon the data and the degree of disclosure, then we might decide that sometimes data is of very moderate or low risk. But at the other end of the spectrum, some kinds of data, if inadvertently released, not anonymised or is re-identified, might cause serious harm to people by revealing very intimate details of their personal lives. So it's with this notion of risk and threat and harm to people that research data ethics has evolved around two fundamental principles, which I think have been already mentioned today by Peter and Mandy. We have, first of all, anonymity, the principle that any data that is released will be subject to attempts to remove any identification attributes in that data, so that it can be reused, shared without the threat of revealing personal information and attaching that information to specific individuals. That may not always be possible for some kinds of research. Some kinds of research necessarily require that the subjects of data remain identifiable. And Peter mentioned, I think, medical research. But increasingly, I think, in social research, where there's an objective of influencing policy and services, then it may be necessary to retain the possibility of identifying subjects contained in data sets. So informed consent is about alerting people to your practices as a researcher, to what extent you're going to de-identify data, what risks there might be of re-identification, what the benefits are, what the objectives are of research, so people can make a sort of balanced decision about whether they want to take part in some research study. What I'm going to argue is that both of these principles are becoming increasingly hard to sustain in the era of big data and data science. First of all, it's well known, using traditional sources of data, that there is a risk of re-identification if you link data together. So, for example, if we have some data that's de-identified, such as, for example, some medical records, and another data set that contains identifiable information, name, address, and so forth, as in, for example, a voter list. If you merge these around common attributes, assuming zip code or postcode, birth date, sex, and so forth, you will be able, with a fairly high degree of precision, to identify the people that are represented in the anonymized data set. So re-identification is possible through data linking. Sometimes that can be useful, but obviously more generally it will be a threat to privacy and confidentiality that perhaps you've promised the subjects when you collected this particular data set. In US data sets of voter lists and so forth, it's estimated that birth date, zip code, and gender are sufficient to identify 87% of the US. I don't know what of people in the US. I don't know what the figure is in the UK, but I suspect it's probably of a similar scale. Now, there are recognized techniques that one can use to reduce the risk of re-identification. One of them is called K-anonymity, where if you take a data set that, if linked with some public data set, might reveal somebody's identity with a high degree of certainty, what you can do is you can perturb or introduce noise into your data such that you can then demonstrate that any linking will not be able to uniquely identify an individual, but may identify a set of individuals of size K, of which the particular individual will be a member of, but therefore they are still, strictly speaking, unidentifiable. Now, whatever K is a matter of choice about sensitivity and scale and attributes in the data set. So obviously one would try to make K as big as possible, but what it might actually turn out to be in practice has to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. But this does provide some protection against re-identification when you're doing data linkage in this conventional way. So, as a summary of current practice in research data ethics, I think what we can agree is that the research process assumes identification of individuals is a practical impossibility with suitable de-identification techniques and perhaps use of techniques like K-anonymity to preserve it in the case of data linkage. The data collection is handled by a small number of people and the findings are anonymized if they're published. The data collection is limited to certain kinds of instruments like surveys, field notes, census, and other public data. And the uses of data can be specified in advance so that we can guarantee that consent has been informed by knowledge about what the data is going to be used for, and of course the good that might come from its use. Okay, so now let's think about the new world of social data that is emerging through what we might collectively term disruptive innovations. Disruptive can mean many different things in this context. Disruptive in terms of people's habits, practices, but importantly for today, disruptive in terms of what we understand as being the challenges of data research, data ethics, and how we can deal with those challenges when we're looking at new kinds of social data. So we've got obviously social media, this wonderfully interesting collection of information which helps us to understand, as social researchers, what people are thinking about today, what their opinions are. From my point of view, it helps to understand what people are doing with technologies and so forth. We've got all these different devices that people carry around with them, which are sensors, able to communicate information about where we are, what we're doing, what's around us, to companies that are able to collect that data and use it for various different kinds of purposes. We've got the Internet of Things, of which this is, if you like, a part. All objects are increasingly becoming connectable, are becoming linked into the global communication system. So your fridge may talk to Sainsbury's when it's empty, and so on and so forth. Your car might be sending back information about where you are at any given moment, etc., etc., etc. This Internet of Things is a global sensor network that is collecting data and sending it to many different organizations that have an interest in trying to use that data for various kinds of predictive and business purposes. Open data, of course, a very welcome initiative for researchers, making data that's not necessarily been easy to get access to in the past, but now being released in ways that hopefully is preserving people's anonymity, but can be used by businesses and researchers to analyze and use for various different objectives. And then we have what we can refer to as big data and data science. The parallel development of new kinds of analytical methods which enable these huge volumes of data to be analyzed. And it's in the combination of big data and data science that the new challenges to research data ethics, I think, arise and need to be understood if we're going to respond to them in appropriate ways. Here's just some predictions about the rise of the Internet of Things over the next 5 years or so. You might wonder what this this y-axis is, what the scale is. Well, it's anybody got any ideas?
Billions.
It's billions, yes. So in 5 years' time, there'll be 50 billion devices out there which are network enabled and thereby able to share their information with a broad range of different organizations, researchers included, but also commercial interests who increasingly see this as being a rich source of business value. So everything is becoming connected. We've got sensor networks, objects which are capable of collecting and sending data back. We've got open data, through various APIs, application programming interfaces that are made available, which anybody can connect to and collect data from. We've got infrastructure, which can be interrogated, health data and so forth. And on our mobile devices and in our other devices, computing devices, we've got apps which do all this kind of data collection, which log our activities and again send that back to a range of different businesses who can use that to deliver services that they think we want and thereby, from a business value point of view, generate income and benefit to consumers. Now, I mentioned data science, so I think it's worthwhile drawing people's attention to the fact that just a few miles away, takes a lot longer to get there today than it did it normally would, but in King's Cross, we have the site of the newly created Alan Turing Institute. I don't know if many of you are aware of that. Funded by EPSRC and which Warwick is a partner and putting $5 million into, along with UCL, Cambridge, Oxbridge and Edinburgh. And this is developing data science tools and techniques using data mining and machine learning to be able to analyze these huge volumes of data so that we can extract information, understanding, predictions and so forth from these new sources of data and for whatever purposes we might have in mind. But we would hope, of course, that they would be informed by an understanding of ethics. I'm very, very pleased to hear in Mandy's presentation today that companies like IBM pay a lot of attention to ethics when they decide on whether they want to develop new kinds of services for their customers. But I think it's probably clear that in the broad landscape of companies that are getting involved in data analytics, not all of them necessarily sign up to an idea of ethics, let alone have any kind of ethical data policy. And that is a concern, and that's what we need to influence, I think, if we're going to help to shape the landscape of ethics and the uses of data now and in the future. And I think that's one of the roles I see from people like myself who are researchers of social informatics, using understanding to help shape the way these technologies and data they produce and the analytical tools that are used to extract value, the way those are deployed so as to maximize the benefit to people but minimize the threats, whatever they may be, to society members. So, data is the new oil. A lot of excitement out there about the huge value that all these new kinds of data have for businesses. It is an oil rush, and people are expending lots and lots of effort to try and discover how to extract the most value from these new sources. Peter mentioned CUSP, which Warwick is a partner in. And that's very much focused, as Peter stated, on being able to understand urban environments, using all the data that's now available in those environments from all these different devices that I mentioned, linking perhaps with other sources, of course, as well, in order to understand people's behavior and influence behavior or adapt services to meet people's needs so that well-being in urban environments can be sustained and improved in the future. So CUSP has developed this urban observatory, so-called, which one part of it which is to do this synoptic view of Manhattan using various different kinds of sensors to extract different kinds of information. So this is a normal optical band sensor. This is one that looks at infrared. And of course you can see here that it's able to spot energy usage, or if not energy usage, then poor insulation in buildings in the city. This can be combined with administrative data sets about buildings, and might be able to be used to improve energy efficiency, the efficiency of the use of energy in the future. What they're also doing is looking to develop what's called sometimes living labs. There's an area in Manhattan called Hudson Yards, which is going to be, they hope, instrumented to a very fine level of granularity, so that literally that population becomes a laboratory of subjects whose everyday lives can be studied in rich detail. I don't know the details of how that's going to be managed ethically, but you can understand the value of that to research for taking on that kind of approach, but also I think understand that there will be perhaps significant ethical issues that not everybody may be aware of when they're asked to sign up to such enterprises. So, big data and data linkage. Well, that hasn't come out too well. The point here is that the World Wide Web, Internet of Things, are designed from the bottom up to be linkable. I think mention was made of the semantic web earlier. That's part of what's being built into the World Wide Web now in order to improve the linkability of different pieces of information out there in the web, thereby making it much more easy to discover information in that infosphere. In the case of social media, we have what's known as a social graph, where people's relationships can be explored, who they're talking to, and so on and so forth, in ways which helps to make people discoverable, reachable, and I'll define what I mean by that in a moment, and perhaps sometimes identifiable. And when it comes to social media in particular, it's possible now to use social media to infer lots of characteristics about people that they're not knowingly disclosing. So, for example, talking to somebody involved in data analytics a couple of weeks ago, he told me that by analysing the use of language in tweets, his company can predict important socio-demographics of individuals, gender, age, social class, and so on and so forth. It's also possible increasingly to look at language use and begin to infer people's mental states, to infer people's mental decline, to detect, for example, Alzheimer's disease, or the early onset of that. So there's all this inference that can be done on these apparently trivial pieces of information, which therefore means people are disclosing a lot more than they ever imagine when they use these technologies. And all these kinds of data are resistant to anonymization through noise. So conventional techniques of tackling risks of disclosure that are result from data linkage in the conventional sense will not work with a lot of these new kinds of data sets. I want to briefly talk about ethical issues when it comes to Twitter data. I don't know if anybody here is doing work on Twitter data. Yeah? So, question that the community, research community, I think is very much engaged with at the moment is Twitter data public and thereby not to be treated with the same kind of ethical care of other kinds of data, or is it actually come under the same ethical principles? This becomes quite important with this kind of data. Do we need to anonymize Twitter data if we publish or not? And what does anonymization mean when it comes to this kind of data? So We're doing work looking at, as I mentioned, trying to understand and predict the veracity of information in social media. And to report on that work, we need to publish extracts of tweets. In particular, what we'll call conversational threads, which reveal how people orientate towards what other people are saying. That's very critical for what we're doing. To ground that research and to make it reviewable and repeatable and verifiable and so on and so forth, in other words, all the sort of gold standards of research publication, we need to make that data available to others to try their own methods on, see if they can repeat our results and so on and so forth. How do you do that with Twitter? What are the obvious kind of problems of anonymizing this data? Well, first of all, you might think, well, we've got names of Twitter, people's Twitter handles here. Maybe we can anonymize those, yeah? So that you can't go onto Twitter and find the person that tweeted that tweet. That sounds fairly robust, or not? Well, actually, it's not, because if you want to find out, if you anonymize the Twitter handle, that's fine. But if you then put the tweet into Twitter, hey presto, Twitter will send back to you the account, the Twitter handle that posted that tweet. If it's not been deleted, it may have been deleted. In some cases, they are for reasons which I'm sure you can guess. But generally speaking, Twitter data will be discoverable. The people posting will be discoverable. Now, you may say, well, they're anonymous, they can use any handle they like, but it's possible then to go from that account using various kinds of creative ways of linking, mashing up other sources of data to discover the identity of that person behind that even anonymous Twitter handle. So there are real problems here with how we treat this data ethically if we want to publish. And I think we're a long way from reaching a consensus about what is the right way forward. But there's a danger if we treat it with the ethical concern that we apply to other sources of data, that Twitter will become unresearchable in practice. Because if we can't report the content, we can't talk about it. Okay, briefly, this was a study that was done on Facebook in the last few years. It was following all the conventional principles of anonymization of data. It collected the profiles of a large number of students, anonymized them, and was being used to look at the evolution of social networks on that particular platform. They were collecting likes and dislikes, etc. And as I say, it was done in compliance with ethical principles of anonymization, also in compliance with funding rules. It's going to be released, but it would be released in anonymized form. It quickly became apparent once it was released that the data was not properly de-identified. It was possible to re-identify people because of the properties of that data, the social networks, the social graphs, the occurrence of particular demographic values, small subsets of data, and so on and so forth. A study by Zimmer revealed just how identifiable this data was, and the result was that the data had to be withdrawn because it was failing to adhere to the principles on which it had been collected. Mandy already mentioned this example in her talk, the case of Target, the company which led to this individual teenage girl, her pregnancy being disclosed to her parents. What this tells us is that, to reinforce the point, that when you give data to companies, you are disclosing information that you don't know you're disclosing. They can find value in that which you had no idea they would discover. What Target did was to match purchasing records of individuals of unknown pregnancy with the purchasing records of individuals, women obviously, who they'd subsequently known to be pregnant. And in that way, they're able to then predict if people's purchasing records were signs or signals of them going to become pregnant, or already pregnant, but perhaps not declared in any clear way. So we are disclosing things we do not know we're disclosing with a lot of these new sources of data. I don't know whether it was serendipity, but this morning I found in my mailbox a message from Wired magazine, which I happened to subscribe to. So I guess it wasn't a result of some deep mining of what I've been doing in recent days preparing this talk. But it had this story in it about the case of Google AdSense. AdSense is the technology Google uses to place adverts in web pages you visit, and also in its search results, based upon various different kinds of information that's collected about your habits, your search habits, and so forth. What this research purports to say is that the AdSense platform is capably a tool of discrimination against people. For example, against women looking for employment, and targeting consumers based on their health information. And moreover, that actually it's tantamount to being out of control as a technology. It's too vast and complex to be brought within sort of ethical management. This is a worrying result if it turns out to be substantiated. Of course, it's quite easy to fall into dystopian views about what big data and data science means for society members. One example of that is what's called now data valence, the systematic surveillance of all records of a person's activities, especially the use of credit cards, mobile phones, email, internet, and so on and so forth. Reflecting the fact that companies like Google and many others are using this data to predict your needs and to infer properties about you which you're not aware of disclosing, ostensibly on the basis or for the reasons of delivering services to you, but effectively invading privacy by making you reachable. It may not necessarily make you identifiable, but you become aware that these companies know something about you you had no idea they knew, because they're using these new techniques. This kind of data linkage, which is not about look across data sets necessarily, but looking at the relationships within data sets that can be exposed by inductive data mining techniques. So, challenges of big data and data science, as I would understand it then, are as follows for ethical conduct. And of course I want to make the point that as a research community we've got to pay attention to these issues, but I think we also need to use our understanding of these issues to try and persuade policymakers, business and so on to follow more ethically sound principles in the ways in which they use data, so that researchers are not alone in following sound ethical principles, but would actually help to shape the way in which these new sources of data and tools are used in wider society, and thereby bring more correspondence, more of a common application of ethical policy across all sectors, not just in the research sector. I think that's our duty, in fact, rather than just attending to our own problems, but to make sure that understanding can influence ethical policy beyond the confines of academic research. So anonymity may be practically meaningless because people can be reached, information can be discovered which people have no awareness that they've disclosed. And inference is a new kind of data linkage because it enables the inference of the attribution of features to people that have not actually actually disclosed in the information that they've made available. And what use is informed consent when using inductive techniques, it's not necessarily clear what we're going to discover. So how can you properly inform people about how the data will be used if the results, the process is driven by inductive methods which are a priori unknowable before you start the process of analysis. And there's the tyranny of the minority. Even though you might opt out of having of disclosing data, because your data is in a large collection of data provided by other people, if only a small number of people in that set have disclosed personal information, then that inferencing processes can get to work. And it's possible to induce attributes that you haven't yourself handed over to data collectors, as the target example illustrates very well. It's very timely then that, and Peter is a contributor to this, this book, Privacy, Big Data and the Public Good, edited by Julia Lane, coming in part from CUSP. I think it's a very good read if you want to learn more about the more socially problematic issues to do with privacy and ethics, not just in academic context but beyond. And exposing what the risks are to society as these techniques and new sources of data are more and more widely used. So what is our response? Well, one response I think might be around the whole question of the ownership of data. Because at the moment, ownership of data seems to be sort of finessed or ignored in many discussions. Let me ask you a question. How many people work for Facebook? Any idea? Pardon? Quite a small number. How many? A couple of hundred, okay. 10,000? Okay. All right. Actually, I think if you think about this carefully, you will come to realize that the number is about, our latest estimates, about 1 billion. Because we're all working for Facebook. If you've got a Facebook account, you're working for Facebook. If you've got a Twitter account, you're working for Twitter. I think it's incumbent upon us to ask us whether that is a good relationship, because we're being monetized, and often, as has been articulated earlier, we're doing so without paying much attention to what that data is being used for, because we're being dangled the possibility of using the platform as some kind of quid pro quo for the monetary value of that data. And ownership effectively passes over to these platforms, meaning that you can no longer control how it's being used and for what purposes effectively. So are there ways we can reclaim ownership of that data and demand transparency of every service that we use? Well, one idea that I think is interesting, but I think requires a lot more thought, is the idea of having a personal data store in which all the data you produce is under your control, and which therefore you can decide who gets to use your data and on what terms, enabling you therefore to have control on the collection, management and consumption of personal data, and giving people direct control thereby of this very valuable source of information. But you recognise, of course, that there are a number of really major challenges to realising this new architecture for the collection and sharing of data. And it's not just a technical architecture we need to create, it's a socio-technical architecture, because not least we need regulatory frameworks that would encourage the service provision and indeed induce the platforms, the businesses that want to collect data and use it, to abandon their current data management models. And that's not going to be easy to negotiate. And without that happening, I think we're left with a technical solution, but without any prospect of it actually being realized in a practical way. One useful side effect, I would say, if this personal data store comes into being, is that researchers may then enjoy the same potential for accessing all these sources of data that businesses enjoy. We hear a lot about open data. I think a lot of people assume when you hear open data, talking about government data, administrative data sets, and so on and so forth. Well, there's a lot more data than that which researchers would like to get access to. Transactional data held by commercial companies, purchasers, and so forth. If we have a personal data store, there's some prospect that owners of that data, you and I, might be able then to provide access to a broader range of data than currently is available to social researchers. And that would be, I think, a very useful step forward for the future. And interestingly, I think we need to also recognize that the current models of data ownership are stifling innovation, that there's a need for a rethinking of a policy around data across the whole spectrum of data collection. To give you one example, and this is what's engaging a lot of people in Brussels at the moment around the digital single market. Who's going to go start a business in search when you're up against Google? Nobody, because you've got no data. Google's got all the data. Should they have all that data, or should they actually be made to make that available to anybody who wants to use it? Handing control over to individuals of that data might have that might invite that option in the longer term. Okay, so that's concludes my talk. This image here, I can't blame it on AdSense for placing it on my slides. I blame it on knowing that my publisher is here, and according to my contract, I'm obliged to tell you about this recently published book, which I edited with Peter Halfpenny, which covers a whole range of topics about digital research methods, innovations in data and analysis. Thank you.
So great.